Hello, U.S. history students. How are you? Miss Ettridge here. As part of your remote assignment for week 5, I am giving you a mini lecture and a PowerPoint that you are going to answer some questions along with, okay? So it's going to be a little bit of reflection of what we did last week, and then I'm going to introduce you to the topics that we're going to start to go over through this remote assignment as well as in our live class. So here is the mini lecture on conflict within the colonies. Let's recap. So in class, we talked about the economic policy of mercantilism. Let's take a minute to do a little refresher on that. Mercantilism was this trade policy that the British used. And ideally, what it stated was that the colonies were the money makers for the mother country. Okay, so the colonies were established primarily to make money for England. Throughout this mercantilism practice, we see that the colonies sold raw materials to England for cheap, okay? So very low prices. So tobacco, lumber, fish, whatever it may be, they sold these products to England for low prices. England then took these raw materials and made them into manufactured goods and then sold them back to the colonies, but they increased the price. So now the colonists had to pay very high prices for these raw materials. Doesn't seem very fair. Also, we see that the British put restrictions on how the colonists could make money, how they could trade, who they could trade with, etc. So this is in correlation with the Navigation Acts that we addressed in class. So the Navigation Act set up a couple different rules, including that the colonists could only trade with the English. If they did want to trade with somebody else, let's say the Spanish who were in Florida, they had to pay a tax or a duty to England. And then the last part of this was that the colonists had to only use English ships for trading. So we see the establishment of these rules and laws, and these were put in place so that the English knew that the colonists were going to do their job in helping England profit. But let's talk about salutary neglect. So although these rules were put into place, they were rarely enforced by the British. The reason why was because sending someone from Britain to the colonies was expensive. Okay, so sending someone there to the colonies to go monitor to make sure that these navigation rules were being followed often didn't happen. So we enter this period of salutary neglect, this time when the rules were put in place, but they weren't enforced. So something to consider is that because they were not enforced, colonists started to trade with the Spanish, with the French, with the Dutch, to make their own money, to start their own economies. Okay, so they started to technically break the rules that were put in place because the British never enforced them. Let's also recap on the Atlantic slave trade. So we went over the triangular trade in class, okay? And as we saw, part of this trade included African slaves. Slavery became increasingly important in the colonies, and as we identified specifically the southern colonies. The reasons why was because wages in England were increasing, so the paid prices that people could make in England were increasing. So we see less people, less immigrants coming over to the colonies for economic opportunities. We still have people migrating, but less, okay? Another reason why was that plantation owners thought that slavery would be a good way to have a stable workforce that they could control. Okay, so this is kind of the start to how colonists would treat African slaves as products that they controlled or property that they controlled. We also see that indigo and rice sales start to increase and tobacco starts to decrease. These products needed large areas, and therefore colonists needed a large amount of workers to work in these areas in order to obtain the raw materials. Okay? As I just identified, we start to see this idea that African slaves were products instead of people. They weren't treated as human beings. Instead, they were treated as property that was going to help the colonists profit. As we talked about in class, the Middle Passage was a specific part of the triangular trade where West African slaves were transported to the West Indies through a brutal journey where they were in ships and stacked on top of one another with no food, with no water. As you can see in this picture up here in the top corner, this is what a layout of the ship would look like. So you can tell that it was a very highly populated area. Okay, so we start to see disease, dehydration, malnutrition, and even death throughout the Middle Passage. So this is what we covered in class. Okay, we have raw materials coming from the colonies to England being sold for low prices. We then have these finished manufactured goods from England being sold back to the colonies, however, at higher prices. We see port cities such as Boston put rum on a ship that is then traded to West Africa. After the rum is taken off the ship in West Africa, we see captive Africans put on the ship and traded to the West Indies as slaves through that Middle Passage that we just discussed. Then after the slaves are traded, we see sugar that is then traded to the colonies where it is turned into rum, and the whole process starts over again. The institution of slavery in the colonies. As we just identified, the number of slaves were increasing within the colonies. To manage these increasing populations of slaves, the colonists adopted laws to ensure that African Americans would be held to their status of slave for life. This also included that children automatically inherited their mother's enslavement for life as well. In 1641, we see that Massachusetts was actually the first to recognize enslavement of lawful captives, and that's a key word there, lawful captive. So by law, as the colonists established, the slaves become property owned by the colonists. Jamestown and Maryland shortly followed. So within this institution of slavery, we see the introduction of racism and superiority based on race by the white colonists. We see rules put in place and present in colonial society, including that white women could not marry African American men. And as I just said, that children automatically inherited their mother's enslavement for life. So we see this reoccurring theme now present in colonial society that Africans are inferior to the white colonists and that they are treated as property owned by the colonists. There are many significant lasting effects from the Atlantic slave trade that need to be brought up. We see this institution of slavery and we see this introduction of racism and these inferiority claims based off of a race. We also know that an estimated amount of 15 to 20 million Africans were shipped from Africa to North America. And we also have to take into consideration and discuss that there was this human cost within the slave trade. People were being traded as if they were property. We see high amounts of death happen. We see freedom being taken away from people. Okay, and we see family members inheriting enslavement and being held captive for the rest of their lives. So these are sensitive and very important features that we need to identify with the slave trade. And we start to see this sense of racism and this sense of superiority by colonists within colonial society. I want to discuss the Great Awakening. As we talked about the different colonies, New England, Middle, and Southern colonies, we talked about religion. Okay, so we see diversity in religious practices. We see Pilgrims, Puritans, Separatists, Quakers, Presbyterians, Catholics, Anglicans, etc. There was a focus on religion, specifically in New England. However, in the early 18th century, this religious spirit dies down a little bit in the colonies. Instead, the colonies start to focus on economic possibilities, making money, accumulating wealth. So it leads to this kind of loss of focus within religion. So as a response, a group of ministers lead a series of revivals within the colonies. Okay, one of them being Jonathan Edwards, who delivers speeches in Northampton, Massachusetts on a revival of religion. So this revival, okay, or this awakening of religion is called the Great Awakening, which is dated from 1730 to the 1770s. Within this time, religious practices are popularized again. They become popular within the colonies, but differently. So through this revival, we see a shift in religious practice and religious identity. Tens of thousands of non-religious colonists, as a response to this, convert to Protestantism. We see church attendance start to change, town setups, colleges, and entertainment all change because of this awakening. One of the colleges that we see as a response to this is Princeton, where Jonathan Edwards actually becomes, I believe, the president of. A significance of the Great Awakening was that it divided the colonies. So as I said, it changed the religious practices. So you had some, the New Lights, who embraced this change in religion within the colonies. But then you had the Old Lights, as they were called, who preferred the traditional practice of religion. There were new denominations that were formed. There was this idea that religion shouldn't be formalized or institutionalized. Instead, it should be a personal connection between an individual and God, and that it should be casual and it should be up to individuals. The most important thing that I want to talk about is that this Great Awakening, it encouraged this revolutionary spirit, okay, this focus on nationalism and on individual rights. It became a notion that there should be democracy in the church, so being able to have that independent identity, and there also should be democracy in the state. So we start to see the foundations of what will later come as the American Revolution start to form. The last part of this mini lecture, I want to talk about conflict in the colonies. We've discussed different areas and different points of conflict within the colonies in class, one of them being with Native Americans. As we know, the English colonies started to see populations increase from the beginning stages. And because of this population increase, the English started to move westward in order to have enough space and to grow more crops and to start to increase their economic opportunities. Native Americans were moving west as well. And there became this dispute because Native Americans were being pushed out of their homeland and being forced to settle elsewhere and try to settle in territories that were also already lived in. So on June 24th, 1675, we see something called the King Philip's War. King Philip, or Metacom, was the chief of the Wampanoags, okay? And we see King Philip and his Native American population versus the English within this King Philip's War. As a result, we see thousands of deaths on both sides. New England towns were burned, villages were destroyed, and specifically the economy of the New England colonies was devastated. We also saw that Native Americans chose to join forces with the English, sometimes. Not all the time, but we do see in some occurrences that Native American groups chose to fight with the English as opposed to fighting with the Native American groups. Something that needs to be taken into consideration is that there was a lot of language diversity within Native American groups. So the message of why they were fighting the English could have been lost sometimes. So that language barrier is something that needs to be taken into consideration. Another area that we see conflict within colonies is with other European powers. So in the 1640s, we see Native American conflict between the colonists. And then we also see this increase in conflict with other European powers, including the Dutch and specifically the French. As a response to this increasing conflict, something called the New England Confederation was formed. This was an alliance between Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and New Haven. And it was basically just an alliance or an agreement that stated that those territories, those colonies, would work together over border disputes, over runaway slaves, and any other conflict that ever was created. we see that this New England Confederation ends up lasting until 1684. So the next thing that we need to talk about is conflict specifically with the French. So the French had this idea of migrating west as well. And the territory in the Ohio River Valley becomes something that creates a very impactful dispute between the French and the British. The Ohio River Valley was an area that had large amounts of fur that could be traded. So it was an area that led to possible profit. The English had claimed that they owned the area, and then the French had claimed that they owned the area. So we see that this dispute starts to happen. By 1750, because of the tension between the British and the French, war is inevitable, and it is known. So let's introduce the French and Indian War. As we just said, it was between Britain and France, and it took place from 1754 to 1763. You also may see this as titled the 7 Years' War. It was the first war that started in the colonies and spread all the way through Europe. So it was over this land dispute, okay, the Ohio River Valley, because both the French and the English wanted to control this territory in order to profit. Native Americans, in response to this war, generally backed the French because they were tired of the harsh conditions that the English were creating for them and how the English had been kicking them out of their homelands, etc. So generally, we see Native American groups join the French side of this war. You do see some Native Americans who choose to remain neutral and uninvolved, and you do see a couple instances where we see Native Americans join the side of the British. For instance, the Iroquois tribe joins the British side when they feel as though the French is going to lose this French and Indian War. So part of your assignment will be to focus on the French and Indian War, specifically the causes and the lasting impacts of this dispute between the French and the British. So answer the questions that are posted along with this mini lecture, and then work your way through the Ed puzzle. And finally, the last part of this remote assignment will be a organizer based on the French and Indian War, okay, where we are first introduced to George Washington. That chart will give you an opportunity to identify the causes, effects, main events, and lasting impacts of the French and Indian War. I will see you in class.